At precisely 8 a.m., the sharp knock at Sarah's door jolted her awake. She tiptoed across the living room, careful not to disturb her 4-year-old son, Ethan, still sound asleep in his small bed. When she opened the door, she was met with the stern face of her former mother-in-law, Linda. "Pack your things and leave," Linda snapped, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Good morning to you too," Sarah replied, her voice laced with sarcasm. "Are you sure you have the right apartment? The psych ward is a few blocks down." "Don't play games with me," Linda hissed. "You have no right to stay here. This is Mark's apartment, and you need to be gone by the end of the day, or I'm calling the police." Sarah crossed her arms and leaned against the doorframe, unflinching. "Interesting. Last I checked, Mark signed over his share of this apartment when Ethan was born. So unless you're the one paying the mortgage, I suggest you calm down." Linda's face flushed with anger. "That's not how this works. Mark needs this apartment to start fresh with Laura. You're standing in the way of his future, and Ethan's too." Sarah's stomach tightened at the mention of Laura. She had known about the affair for months, but hearing Linda speak so casually about the woman who had helped destroy her marriage still stung. "If Mark needs a place to live, he can move in with you and Laura. I'm sure you'd all be very happy together." Linda glared at her, her voice rising. "That's enough. I'm giving you one last chance to leave on your own, or I'll have no choice but to force you out." Sarah took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. "You can try," she said coolly. "But you'll lose. This is my home, and Ethan and I aren't going anywhere." Linda stared at her for a moment, her hands trembling with frustration. "You'll regret this, Sarah. I'll see you in court." Sarah didn't flinch as Linda stormed out, slamming the door behind her. She stood there for a moment, her heart pounding. She knew this was just the beginning of Linda's campaign to take away everything she had left. But Sarah wasn't about to let her win. Walking into Ethan's room, she found him still fast asleep, his small hand clutching his favorite stuffed dinosaur. She knelt beside his bed, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "Don't worry, buddy," she whispered. "I've got this." Sarah spent the rest of the morning sorting through the emotions Linda's visit had stirred. She'd known Linda was controlling and overbearing, but the audacity of showing up unannounced to demand her eviction felt like a new low. As she prepared breakfast for Ethan, memories of her marriage to Mark came flooding back. Mark had swept Sarah off her feet when they first met. He was charming and confident, with a knack for making her feel like the center of the universe. They met at a college alumni event, and what began as casual conversations quickly turned into late-night phone calls and weekend road trips. Within a year, they were engaged, and Sarah believed she had found her happily ever after. The first cracks appeared after their wedding. Mark was close to his mother, closer than Sarah had realized. At first, Linda's involvement in their lives seemed innocuous enough. She insisted on hosting holiday dinners and offered unsolicited advice about everything from Sarah's cooking to their choice of furniture. "Oh, honey," Linda had said with a forced laugh the first time she saw their couch. "You'll regret buying something so modern. It'll be out of style in no time." Sarah brushed it off, not wanting to create conflict. "She just cares too much," Mark would say, always quick to defend his mother. But as time went on, Linda's influence became suffocating. She would drop by unannounced, criticizing Sarah's housekeeping or hinting that she wasn't doing enough to support Mark's demanding career. When Ethan was born, things went from bad to worse. Linda's helpful advice turned into outright interference. "You're holding him wrong," she'd say, snatching Ethan from Sarah's arms. "He'll never sleep through the night if you coddle him like that." Mark, rather than standing up for Sarah, would laugh nervously and suggest they listen to his mom. "She raised me, didn't she?" he'd say. Sarah began to feel like an outsider in her own family. Mark seemed more focused on pleasing Linda than supporting his wife. Whenever Sarah voiced her concerns, he dismissed them. "She doesn't mean anything by it," he'd say. "Just let it go." But Sarah couldn't let it go. She had sacrificed so much for their marriage, her career, her independence, only to feel undermined at every turn. The final blow came 2 years ago, when Mark began staying late at work and avoiding her questions about his schedule. Sarah's suspicions grew, but she wanted to believe the best in him. One evening, after putting Ethan to bed, Sarah decided to check Mark's phone, a move she had resisted for months. Her heart sank as she read through messages between him and Laura, a co-worker. The messages weren't just flirtatious, they were intimate. Photos, plans for weekend getaways, and confessions of love. It was all there. When Sarah confronted Mark, he didn't deny it. "I didn't plan for this to happen," he said, his tone defensive. "But Laura understands me in a way you never did." "What about Ethan?" Sarah demanded, her voice shaking. "What about the family we built?" Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'll always be there for Ethan, but I can't stay in a marriage that makes me miserable." Miserable. The word echoed in Sarah's mind as she stared at the man she had once loved. He had made his choice, and it wasn't her or Ethan. Mark moved out shortly after that conversation, leaving Sarah to pick up the pieces. Linda, of course, wasted no time inserting herself into the situation. She took Mark's side completely, treating Sarah like an interloper in her own life. When Sarah refused to give up the apartment, Linda's anger turned into a relentless campaign to drive her out. Now, as Sarah watched Ethan happily munch on his cereal, she felt a renewed sense of determination. Linda might have had the upper hand in the past, but not anymore. Sarah had endured enough, and she wasn't going to let anyone, Mark, Linda, or Laura, dictate her future. "Mommy, can we go to the park today?" Ethan asked, his eyes lighting up. Sarah smiled, ruffling his hair. "Of course, sweetheart. Let's go have some fun." As they left the apartment, Sarah felt the weight of her memories begin to lift. This wasn't the life she had planned, but it was hers. And she was ready to fight for it. Sarah's resolve was tested sooner than she expected. Just a few days after Linda's dramatic visit, Sarah received a letter from Mark's lawyer. It wasn't just about the apartment, it was a formal notice that Mark intended to pursue joint custody of Ethan. The words blurred as Sarah reread the letter, her hands trembling. Mark hadn't shown any real interest in Ethan since the divorce. His visits were infrequent, his calls sporadic at best. Now, out of nowhere, he wanted to be a part of Ethan's life. Sarah didn't believe it for a second. This was Linda's doing. Linda had made her opinion of Sarah's parenting clear on more than one occasion. "Ethan needs stability," she had said during one particularly heated argument. "You're barely holding things together, Sarah. Mark can give him the kind of life he deserves." Sarah knew this custody fight wasn't about Ethan's well-being, it was about control. Linda couldn't stand that Sarah had any say over Ethan's life, and she was using Mark as a pawn to gain more influence. That evening, Sarah sat at her kitchen table, the letter spread out in front of her. She knew she needed to act quickly. Picking up her phone, she called Marina, the lawyer who had helped her navigate the property dispute. "I just got this," Sarah said, her voice tight with anger as she explained the situation. "What are my options?" Marina listened patiently before responding. "Custody battles are tough, but the good news is that you have a strong case. You're Ethan's primary caregiver, and Mark's history of limited involvement will work in your favor. The key is to document everything: visits, calls, financial support, any communication. We need to build a clear picture of who's really been there for Ethan." Relief mingled with determination as Sarah hung up. If Mark and Linda wanted a fight, they were going to get one. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of preparation. Sarah kept a meticulous record of every interaction with Mark and Linda, from missed calls to passive-aggressive texts. She also collected evidence of her role as Ethan's primary caregiver, receipts for school supplies, notes from teachers praising her involvement, and even photos of the countless activities she had organized for Ethan. Linda, meanwhile, doubled down on her efforts to undermine Sarah. She began showing up uninvited at Ethan's daycare, making a show of being the doting grandmother. One afternoon, Sarah arrived to pick Ethan up, only to find Linda already there, chatting with one of the staff members. "Grandma was here today," Ethan said excitedly as they walked to the car. "She brought me a toy." Sarah forced a smile, but inside, her frustration boiled. Linda wasn't just trying to win Ethan's affection, she was trying to paint Sarah as an inattentive mother. Marina's advice echoed in her mind: don't react emotionally. Document everything. Mark's involvement, however, was half-hearted at best. During one scheduled visit, he showed up nearly an hour late, offering a flimsy excuse about a work meeting running over. Sarah took a photo of the clock on her wall and noted the time in her journal. Later, when Ethan returned home, he mentioned that Mark had spent most of the visit on his phone. The final straw came when Sarah overheard a conversation between Linda and Mark during a daycare event. She had arrived early to pick up Ethan and found a quiet spot near the playground to wait. Linda's voice carried clearly over the noise of the children. "You need to show the court you're serious," Linda said sharply. "If you don't step up, Sarah's going to win, and then she'll think she can keep Ethan from us forever." "I'm trying, Mom," Mark replied, sounding exasperated. "But my schedule." "Make time," Linda snapped. "This isn't just about you. It's about Ethan. He deserves better than what Sarah can give him." Sarah's blood ran cold. This wasn't about Mark wanting to be a father, it was about Linda trying to gain control. That night, Sarah sat down with Marina and shared everything she had gathered. The lawyer was impressed. "You're doing everything right," Marina said. "Linda and Mark are trying to create a narrative, but the evidence is on your side. We'll file our response to the custody petition and include these records. They're painting you as an unfit mother, but we'll prove otherwise." As Sarah left Marina's office, she felt a flicker of hope. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for Ethan's future. No matter how relentless Linda and Mark were, she wasn't going to back down. The day of the custody hearing arrived, and Sarah's nerves were on edge. The courthouse buzzed with activity, but she felt like time had slowed to a crawl. She sat next to Marina at the plaintiff's table, clutching a folder filled with her carefully documented evidence. Across the room, Mark and Linda sat together, whispering occasionally as their lawyer shuffled papers. Mark avoided Sarah's gaze, but Linda stared straight at her, radiating smug confidence. Marina leaned in and whispered, "Stay calm. You've got this." When the judge entered, the room fell silent. The proceedings began with Mark's lawyer presenting their case. Predictably, they painted Mark as a father who was simply trying to reconnect with his son after a challenging divorce. Linda's role was highlighted as a loving grandmother who had always been present for Ethan. "As you'll see from our witnesses and testimony," Mark's lawyer concluded, "it is in Ethan's best interest to have equal access to both of his parents, as well as the additional stability provided by his grandmother." Sarah gritted her teeth. Stability? Linda was the source of chaos in her life, not stability. When it was Marina's turn to speak, she approached the bench with confidence. "Your Honor, while my client fully supports Ethan's relationship with his father and grandmother, the reality is that Mark Porter has shown little interest in actively participating in his son's life until now. This petition is not about reconnecting with Ethan, it is a calculated move influenced by Linda Porter to gain control over decisions that should rest with my client, Sarah Porter." Marina began presenting the evidence Sarah had collected. There were timestamps of Mark's tardiness during visits, screenshots of texts in which he cancelled plans at the last minute, and daycare records showing that Sarah was consistently the one attending events, handling drop-offs, and picking Ethan up. She also played a recording of Linda's conversation with the daycare staff, in which she claimed Sarah wasn't providing a stable home for Ethan. The judge's expression grew stern as the audio played, his gaze shifting briefly to Linda, who squirmed in her seat. The most compelling evidence came when Marina called Sarah to testify. Sarah recounted her experiences raising Ethan as a single mother, detailing her role as his primary caregiver. She spoke about the sacrifices she had made to provide him with a stable and loving home, her voice steady but filled with emotion. When asked about Mark's involvement, Sarah chose her words carefully. Mark has the potential to be a great father, but the truth is, he hasn't been there for Ethan. It's been me who wakes up with him when he's sick, helps him with his homework, and takes him to every doctor's appointment and school event. I'm not saying Mark doesn't love Ethan, but actions speak louder than words. Mark's lawyer attempted to discredit Sarah, suggesting that her reluctance to share custody stemmed from bitterness over the divorce. But Marina quickly shut down that narrative, pointing out that Sarah had never denied Mark access to Ethan and had, in fact, encouraged their relationship despite the circumstances. The turning point came when Linda was called to testify. Her composure faltered as Marina questioned her about her involvement in the custody petition. You've been to Ethan's daycare several times without Sarah's knowledge, correct? Marina asked. I was just trying to help, Linda said defensively. Ethan needs a strong support system. Did you ever imply to the daycare staff that Sarah was unfit to care for Ethan? Marina pressed. Linda hesitated. I might have mentioned some concerns, but that was out of love for my grandson. Out of love, Marina repeated. Yet you've taken steps to undermine Sarah at every turn, including encouraging your son to file for custody despite his lack of consistent involvement. Is that also out of love? Linda's face reddened, and her answers grew evasive. By the time her testimony ended, the confident front she had displayed earlier was gone. After closing arguments, the judge adjourned the hearing, stating that he would deliver his decision the following week. As Sarah left the courtroom, she felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. She had done everything she could, but the final outcome was out of her hands. A few days later, Sarah received the news. The court ruled in her favor. Mark was granted visitation rights, but Sarah retained full custody of Ethan. The judge's decision noted that while Mark and Linda clearly cared for Ethan, their actions had demonstrated a lack of understanding about what was truly in his best interest. When Sarah told Ethan the news, he smiled and hugged her tightly. Does this mean we don't have to move? He asked. That's right, sweetheart, Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. We're staying right here, where we belong. As she held him close, Sarah felt a wave of gratitude and relief. The battle wasn't easy, but she had fought for her son and won. Mark's life with Laura, the woman for whom he had left Sarah, was far from the fresh start he had imagined. At first, things seemed perfect. Laura was attentive and fun, everything Mark had convinced himself was missing in his marriage to Sarah. But as the weeks turned into months, cracks began to form in their relationship. Laura had a child from a previous relationship, a lively 5-year-old boy named Logan. Mark tried to bond with Logan, but the boy was cautious and often defiant. You're not my dad, Logan said one evening when Mark tried to discipline him for leaving toys scattered across the living room. Mark turned to Laura for support, but she shrugged off the tension. He'll come around, she said, scrolling through her phone. Just give him time. Time, however, only seemed to deepen the divide. Laura's carefree attitude began to wear on Mark, especially as he struggled to manage his demanding job alongside the responsibilities of their blended household. He found himself longing for the stability and structure Sarah had provided. Meanwhile, Laura's enthusiasm for being a stepmother to Ethan had cooled considerably. During Mark's scheduled visitation weekends, Laura often made herself scarce, leaving Mark to juggle Logan and Ethan alone. One Saturday, as the boys bickered over a video game, Mark snapped, raising his voice in frustration. Why are you yelling at them? Laura asked later, her tone accusatory. You need to figure out how to keep them entertained. It's not my job. Mark was taken aback. We're supposed to be a team, Laura. I thought you wanted to be involved in Ethan's life. Laura rolled her eyes. I didn't sign up to be a full-time babysitter, Mark. Maybe you should have thought about that before fighting for custody. Her words hit Mark like a punch to the gut. He had fought for joint custody to please Linda, not because he truly wanted it. Now, He realized how little thought he had given to what that arrangement would mean, not just for him, but for Ethan. Mark's frustration grew as Linda continued to interfere. She frequently called to check in, offering unsolicited advice about his parenting. "You need to show Ethan more discipline," she said during one call. "He's becoming too attached to Sarah, and that's not healthy." "I'm doing my best, Mom," Mark replied, though he didn't believe it himself. "You need to do better," Linda snapped. "You let Sarah walk all over you in court. Don't let her win in the long run." Mark hung up, exhausted by the constant pressure from his mother. He was beginning to see what Sarah had endured for years, and it wasn't a pleasant realization. The turning point came one evening when Mark arrived at Sarah's apartment to drop Ethan off. Ethan had spent the weekend withdrawn and quiet, and Mark was determined to figure out why. But as they approached the door, Ethan hesitated, clutching his backpack tightly. "What's wrong, buddy?" Mark asked, crouching down to meet his son's gaze. Ethan's eyes welled with tears. "I don't like it at your house, Dad," he whispered. "Logan is mean to me, and I miss Mommy." Mark felt a lump rise in his throat. He wanted to argue, to explain that he was trying his best, but the look on Ethan's face stopped him. For the first time, he saw how his choices had affected his son. "I'm sorry, Ethan," Mark said softly. "I'll try to make things better." Ethan nodded but didn't say anything as he stepped into Sarah's apartment. Sarah, who had overheard the conversation, gave Mark a questioning look but didn't say a word. She simply took Ethan's hand and led him inside, closing the door behind her. Mark stood in the hallway for a long moment, staring at the closed door. The life he had walked away from felt so far out of reach now, and for the first time, he wondered if he had made a terrible mistake. But even as regret gnawed at him, Mark knew that trying to go back wasn't an option. Sarah had moved on, and so had Ethan. Now, all Mark could do was try to find a way forward, a way to be the father Ethan deserved, even if he couldn't be the man Sarah needed anymore. Linda sat in her living room, the familiar weight of frustration pressing down on her. She had spent years fighting to maintain control over her family, believing she knew what was best for her son, her grandson, and everyone in between. But now, everything was falling apart. Mark's life with Laura was in shambles. He called less frequently, and when he did, his voice was tired, his answers clipped. "Everything's fine," he insisted whenever Linda pried, but she knew better. The custody arrangement with Ethan wasn't bringing the family closer together, it was pushing them further apart. And Sarah? Sarah had won. Not just the custody battle, but the quiet war Linda had waged against her since the day she married Mark. Sarah had built a life for herself and Ethan that didn't include Linda, and for the first time, Linda was beginning to see the consequences of her actions. One afternoon, Linda decided to visit Sarah. She told herself it was to check on Ethan, but deep down, she knew it was more than that. Standing on Sarah's doorstep, she hesitated before knocking. When Sarah opened the door, her expression was unreadable. "Linda," Sarah said, crossing her arms. "What are you doing here?" "I wanted to see Ethan," Linda said, her voice wavering slightly. "He's at school," Sarah replied. "Is there something else you need?" Linda hesitated, searching for the right words. I wanted to apologize." Sarah blinked, clearly taken aback. "Apologize?" "Yes," Linda said, her voice firmer now. "I know I've been difficult. I thought I was doing what was best for Ethan, but I see now that I've overstepped." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Overstepped?" "Linda, you tried to take my son from me. You encouraged Mark to fight for custody when he barely knew how to care for Ethan. Do you have any idea how much damage that caused?" Linda's face flushed, but she didn't look away. "I know," she said quietly. "I know I hurt you. And I hurt Ethan. I didn't want to lose my family." "You didn't lose your family," Sarah said, her tone softening slightly. "You pushed us away." Linda's shoulders slumped as Sarah's words sank in. For years, she had convinced herself that her actions were justified, that she was protecting her family. But now, standing in front of Sarah, she saw the truth. "I'm sorry," Linda said again, her voice breaking. "I can't undo what I've done, but I want to try to make things right." Sarah studied her for a long moment before responding. "I appreciate the apology, Linda. But things can't go back to the way they were. I've worked too hard to build a stable life for Ethan, and I won't let anything jeopardize that. If you want to be part of his life, you have to respect my boundaries." Linda nodded, her throat tightening. "I understand." "I hope you do," Sarah said. "Because this is your last chance." In the weeks that followed, Linda made an effort to rebuild her relationship with Ethan, this time on Sarah's terms. She visited less frequently and kept her opinions to herself, focusing instead on spending quality time with her grandson. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when she wanted to revert to her old ways, but she forced herself to hold back. For Linda, it was a humbling experience. She had spent so much of her life trying to control others, only to realize that control was an illusion. Now, all she could do was take small steps toward repairing the damage she had done. For Sarah, the days following the custody battle felt like stepping into a new chapter. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was constantly looking over her shoulder, bracing for Linda's interference or Mark's half-hearted attempts at parenting. Her home was a place of peace again, filled with the sound of Ethan's laughter and the quiet satisfaction of stability. Sarah threw herself into creating the best life possible for her son. She found a part-time job as a program coordinator for a local nonprofit, allowing her to work flexible hours while Ethan was in school. The job gave her a sense of purpose and fulfillment she hadn't felt in years, and the supportive community she found there quickly became her extended family. Ethan thrived as well. He excelled in his kindergarten class, his teachers often commenting on how curious and kind he was. "He's a reflection of you," one teacher told Sarah during a parent-teacher conference. Those words stayed with her, a reminder that despite everything, she had done something right. Sarah's relationship with Linda had shifted too. While Sarah remained cautious, she couldn't deny that Linda was making an effort. Linda showed up to Ethan's school events on time, kept her visits respectful, and focused on building a bond with her grandson rather than critiquing Sarah. One afternoon, Linda brought Ethan home after a trip to the park. As he ran inside to show Sarah the pine cones he had collected, Linda lingered at the door. "You're doing a good job with him," Linda said, her tone sincere. Sarah blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "Thank you," she said after a pause. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation, but it was a start. Outside of her role as a mother, Sarah began to rediscover who she was as a person. She joined a yoga class at the local community center, finding solace in the quiet rhythm of movement and breath. She also reconnected with old friends, inviting them over for coffee and catching up on years of missed conversations. One evening, while scrolling through her email, Sarah noticed a message from the organization she worked for. They were inviting her to apply for a leadership position, a step up that would involve more responsibility but also more opportunities to make an impact. She hesitated, unsure if she was ready for such a big change. When she shared her doubts with her best friend, Rachel, the response was immediate. "Are you kidding? You're perfect for this. Think about everything you've overcome. If anyone can handle this, it's you." Sarah took a deep breath and submitted her application the next day. The day she was offered the position, Sarah celebrated by taking Ethan out for ice cream. As they sat together in the shop, Ethan looked up at her, his face smeared with chocolate. "Mommy," he said, "are you happy?" Sarah smiled, her heart full. "Yes, sweetheart," she said. "I am." For Sarah, happiness wasn't about erasing the past or forgetting the pain. It was about embracing the future, one small step at a time. She had learned to trust herself, to set boundaries, and to fight for what mattered most. And in doing so, she had found a strength she never knew she had. Years had passed since Sarah's life had been turned upside down. The wounds from her marriage to Mark and the battles with Linda had faded, leaving behind scars that told a story of resilience and growth. She stood in her kitchen one sunny morning, making pancakes as Ethan, now a lively 10-year-old, played outside with a group of neighborhood kids. The house felt like a true home now, a place filled with laughter, warmth, and memories they had built together. Sarah had flourished in her career, eventually becoming the director of her nonprofit. She took pride in her work, knowing it was helping families in need while setting an example for Ethan about perseverance and compassion. One afternoon, while sorting through old boxes in the attic, Sarah stumbled upon a photo album from her early days with Mark. The pictures told a bittersweet story: smiling wedding photos, a proud moment at Ethan's first birthday party, a vacation to the mountains before everything fell apart. She flipped through the pages slowly, pausing at a photo of Mark holding Ethan as a baby. For a moment, she let herself feel the pang of nostalgia, but it didn't last long. That chapter of her life was closed, and she was at peace with how it had ended. Later that week, Sarah received an unexpected call from Mark. It had been years since they'd spoken beyond the necessary logistics of co-parenting. His voice was subdued, almost hesitant. "Sarah," he began, "I wanted to thank you. For everything. For raising Ethan, for being there when I wasn't." Sarah leaned against the kitchen counter, processing his words. "You've had your moments, Mark," she said, her tone calm but firm. "But Ethan's life isn't about either of us anymore, it's about him. I've done what I could to make sure he has the stability he needs." "I know," Mark said quietly. "And you've done an amazing job. I just wish I'd realized sooner." There was no bitterness in Sarah's heart, only a quiet sense of finality. "I hope you can be there for him now," she said. "He deserves that." Linda had also changed over the years. Age had softened her sharp edges, and she had grown to respect Sarah in a way she never had before. She occasionally joined Sarah and Ethan for family dinners, bringing small gifts and stories about her childhood. While Sarah kept their relationship polite and guarded, she appreciated Linda's efforts to be a positive presence in Ethan's life. As the years rolled on, Sarah found new joys and connections. She began dating again, cautiously at first, and eventually met someone who appreciated her strength and independence. Their relationship wasn't built on sweeping romance but on mutual respect and shared values, a stark contrast to her marriage with Mark. Ethan liked him too, which made all the difference. One evening, as Sarah and Ethan sat on their porch watching the sunset, he turned to her with a thoughtful expression. "Mom, do you think Dad and Grandma will ever be like us?" he asked. Sarah smiled gently. "Maybe," she said. "But what matters is that we are. And we've got a pretty great thing going, don't we?" Ethan nodded, resting his head against her shoulder. "Yeah, we do." Sarah's life had come full circle, not back to where it started but to a place of strength, peace, and gratitude. The struggles she had endured had shaped her into the person she was today, a devoted mother, a successful professional, and a woman who had learned the power of standing her ground. For Sarah, the future was bright, and she was ready to embrace it, one day at a time.